Hey, welcome back everybody, showing up at the start as the YouTube algorithm requires of me now, among many other things. It's time for the monthly oil production levels update, for countries that report their data at least. So heading right down the list, starting with Angola, a former OPEC member who left a year and a half ago, Qatar, Ecuador, Angola, the UAE, and now Iraq is about to leave as well. Angola peaked at about 2 million barrels per day a while ago and has since declined down closer to 1, where they have managed to hold off that decline temporarily, adding a few new fields offshore each year at just enough of a pace to stay above 1. This time they came in at 1.1 million barrels per day. Algeria peaked at 1.4 a while ago. They had declined down to 1 before the major production cuts that lasted for the entire first half of the 2020s, where they held down between 800 and 900,000. They had been trying to recover now back up to 1 million or as close to it as they can manage. However, now they have hit a flat 990,000. Argentina was once up at about 800,000 barrels per day, and over time they declined down to about 400,000 until they started fracking operations in the Vaca Muerta shale, which has brought them back up and over 800, now over 900,000 barrels per day, coming in at 910. Azerbaijan peaked at about 1.1 million. They have since declined over the last 2 decades or so, or a decade and a half, down under the halfway point now, under 550, coming in at 540,000 barrels per day. Australia peaked at about 800 and have since over time declined down now into the mid or even lower 200s, this time actually coming in down at 217. Brazil just continuing on their way upwards over the decades, and they're probably going to have an inevitable peak somewhere between 6, maybe 6.5. But for the moment, recently they had reached 4.34 million barrels per day, and this time they managed to go up just a bit higher over the past month, up to 4.35. Canada, after having to shut some production down because of wildfire proximity, has bumped back up over 5 million and is back up to just over 5.1 at 5.12. China continuing to hold on in the lower fours, continuing to avoid resuming its prior decline, at least temporarily. And this time they came in at 4.37 million barrels per day. Meanwhile, their domestic consumption is up around 16 or 17. However, they have reached their plateau demand wise. Colombia continuing its decline from its second peak at 1 million, now down into the mid and starting to enter lower 700,000s. Recently was at 735. This time they bumped back up to 740. The smaller of the two Congos, not the giant one where all the cobalt is continuing to hold in the upper 200s, closer to 300, this time coming in again at 286,000. Ecuador hit its highest point at about 550 and stayed there for a bit before entering a very gradual terminal decline, and they are now down into the upper mid 400s, this time coming in at 461. Egypt was once up around 1 million in production. However, over time they've declined down now to only around half a million, this time coming in at 501,000. Meanwhile, their own demand, their domestic consumption, is now just under 1 million barrels per day. Gabon has peaked up in the 300,000s a couple times. They had since declined all the way down to 180, but some moderately sized new fields offshore recently brought them back up to around 230 or 240 and are now back down to around 220, this time coming in just a bit back up at 224. Ghana got up to 214 at one point, declines down to about 150. Enhanced recovery operations brought it back up to 190, from which it's been declining. They're now back down to 178. However, two new projects offshore will be coming online in the next year or so that will bump them up close to 300,000. Guyana, with its fourth field now in full production, is hovering between 900,000 and 910,000. and its next field will be coming online in the next few months that will bump it up to over 1.1 million barrels per day. India held around or a bit under 800,000 for a while. They declined down through the upper 500s eventually. However, they did bring online a new 50,000 barrel per day offshore field that has brought them back up a little over 600 to between 600 and 620,000. Meanwhile, their domestic consumption, however, has now exceeded 6 million barrels per day. Indonesia once produced 1.6 million consistently for 3 decades. However, they reached the end of their field's capabilities and have since declined all the way down under 600, coming in this time at 580, while their domestic consumption in present day is usually up around now 2.4 million. Iraq was producing roughly around 4.5 before the Iran war started and the Strait got choked off and they had to shut everything down like the other Persian Gulf producers, except for now the stuff they have going out through their northern pipelines via Turkey. And so until recently, they were back up to producing about 1.6 or 1.7 million. And then it looked like things were going to be okay for a while, like the Strait was going to stay open. So everybody started calling oil tankers back in, started turning production back up and filling them again. Iraq got back up to 2.1 million barrels per day before the whole thing restarted again at the start of this week. And now the strait's completely shut down again, and everyone is having to turn the dials back down. Iran once held a 6 million barrel per day plateau until the revolution happened. Afterwards, they were never able to restore that. Only got up to 4 million, managed to hold that for a few decades until the mega sanctions, which saw them drop down to only around 2 million, only meeting their own domestic consumption levels. And then the sanctions were lifted, but because of degradation and damage over time, they were only able to restore their production back up to just under 3.4, and were in decline actually, and had declined down closer to 3.1 until the war started, of course. And they too were beginning to turn everything back on before it restarted, and they had gotten back up to 2.44 million barrels per day. Kazakhstan is back up over 2 million after one of their larger fields, one of their larger sites, had to shut down again for a month or two because it caught fire again, but now they're back up to 2.26. Kuwait was being very slow to restore their 3 million barrel per day plateau after the production cuts ended, and they were up at about 2.7 before the Iran war started, which saw them then have to drop all the way down to 580,000. However, as it looked like things were open again, they started loading tankers and brought their production back up to 1.37 until the start of this week. And since then, they have obviously started shutting everything back down again. Libya continuing to climb back upwards, restoring their lost pre 2011 production. They're now almost back up over 1.5 million barrels per day, coming in just short of it at 1.49. Malaysia wobbled around in the 800,000s for a while, started declining though, and went down to around 450. However, it did add some new fields. Most of what they have offshore is natural gas, but there were some oil fields out there, and they brought those online recently, some of them at least, brought them back up to between 530 and 550. However, a number of others have shut down for maintenance at the moment, which has seen them temporarily drop back under 500 down to 494,000. Mexico, once a decent producer, up over 3.5 million, about 2.5 or 3 decades ago. However, they've declined from their peak down to the upper ones, but they have managed to hold out here, and they should be able to hold here until at least the end of this decade. This time in particular, they came in at 1.72 million, and their domestic consumption levels have now returned to about 2 million barrels per day. Nigeria once held around 2 million for a while, and after their crash that was caused by a variety of different factors from terrorism, oil pipeline theft, lack of reinvestment in the infrastructure because government officials were just taking the money for themselves, they had dropped all the way to 1. However, they've been restoring their capabilities and are now back up over 1.5. This time in particular, they came in at 1.56. Norway, Norway once up at 3.5, fell down as low as 1.5. However, as they've expanded operations into their middle shelf and their Arctic waters, they've brought themselves back up mostly over 2. This time they have a few offshore sites shut down for maintenance, so they're down a little bit under 2 at 1.91. Oman was holding at about 1, even though they weren't part of OPEC, they were still adhering to the production cuts anyways. And after the cuts ended, they were slowly bringing their production upwards. However, once the Iran war started and everyone, the world collectively, was looking for suppliers to turn things up as fast as possible, they started increasing as quickly as they could. And now they're up close to 1.1, this time coming in at 1.08. And their highest output capacity is probably around 1.3, but we'll see when they get close to it. Qatar left OPEC because it was tired of eternal production cuts and quota limits. So they got up to 1.5, declined from that down to 1.3. Some enhanced projects at their largest field have managed to keep them around 1.3 up until the last year or two. They've started declining very slowly. However, then the Iran war started and they had to shut everything down like everyone else. And they got as low as only a couple 100,000 because that's their domestic consumption level. However, as the strait was seemingly open, they began loading tankers again, turned their production back up to 710,000 until the start of this week, from which they have now begun shutting everything back down again. Russia declaring their data classified. It's become very difficult to pin down Russia's actual level, but up until just before Ukraine's campaign of absolute removal of Russia's oil and gas infrastructure from the face of the earth, Russia had already fallen down through various other means all the way to under 8.5. However, with the continuing cascade and especially pipeline flow stoppages, they're more likely closer to 8 than they are to 8.5. Saudi Arabia, normally holding a 10 million barrel per day plateau, except under the permanent production cuts that were primarily their idea anyways. But anyways, they were one of the ones who actually had a diversion pipeline that they could get oil out via other means through the Red Sea. It was only enough to maintain 5 million barrels per day of exports, plus a bit over 2 million for their domestic consumption. So their production was down to roughly around, but usually a bit over 7 million. However, as the strait was open, they started loading at Ras Tanura again, turned their production back up to 9 million until the start of this week when the war restarted in full, and now they're having to shut that extra 2 million off again. Thailand held a plateau in the mid 200,000s for a while, but have since declined down to the mid and upper 100s, where they are managing to hold off here for the moment at least, coming in recently at 172,000. Turkmenistan in present day is somewhere between 200 and 210, but they're not the most clear with their data either. The UAE was able to still produce about 2.5, a bit for their own consumption, plus they were still able to export close to 2 million barrels per day because they have a pipeline that goes around the strait as well. And as soon as it looked like things were clear and they started loading tankers, they dialed their production way up because they had been wanting to go to a plateau of 4 million instead of 3 million for a while, which is part of the reason why they left OPEC a couple months ago. The latest in the quickly accelerating train of members who are leaving. And just before the war restarted at the start of this week, they had gotten up to 3.8 million barrels per day. The UK was once up around 3 million, but their North Sea days are long behind them. They have declined all the way down to around 600, and that's where they came in this time as well. The US, once again, for the fourth or fifth time now over this roughly 2 year period, has touched 13.8 and tied the previous one at 13.86 as the US has reached its peak or plateau and is seeing a repeating pattern of declining by a few 100,000 as shale has reached its limits, plus original conventional stuff declining in the background as well. But then a large new field offshore or a project back up home in Alaska will come online and suddenly surge production by a couple 100,000 barrels per day, from which the decline will then resume within a few weeks. Venezuela, once producing 3 million. However, when they collapsed in the later 2010s, they took the oil production down with them and got all the way down to 400,000. And while mostly on their own, they very slowly were able to creep it over the course of almost 7 years back up to about one or so, or about 1.1. And then the 24-hour war with the US happened, in which the US replaced the Venezuelan regime. And the new Venezuelan regime has allowed any and all foreign oil industry in, who have been rapidly revamping things and brought Venezuela back up by a couple 100,000, up to as high as 1.27, this time just a bit under that at 1.25. And Vietnam held a plateau in the mid 300,000s for a couple decades, but reached the end of their ability to maintain that, and they've declined down to the mid and upper 100s, this time coming in at 186,000. Anyways, that's it for this one. Thank you everybody for sticking around and listening. Like if you enjoyed, subscribe if you haven't already. PayPal and Patreon are down there if you want to support me. Only do so if you actually can. The Google Drive with all these graphs and hundreds of other different kinds of graphs for you to use for free, that's available in the description. There's a link in the top pinned comment to my cat's YouTube channel. May God bless and protect all of you, and I will see you all around next time.